Hi, welcome to my presentation. It's Raining Poetry, Street Art with a Social Message. I'm Zach Ramsey. As an English teacher, I love poetry, but I have students sometimes who are not as passionate as I am. So in this video, I'm going to describe an engaging hands-on poetry unit I taught in which my students collaborated to create unique street art poetry with a social message. But before I go any further, I want to shout out the NCTE for hosting another amazing conference. Even if we're fully virtual again this year, which I'm kind of bummed about, because if we were in Louisville together, as was the original plan, I would just point east and explain that for 5 years I taught English language arts right over there in Shelby County, which is just east of Louisville. It is the next county over, and the project that I'm going to share with you in this video took place in Shelby County, Kentucky. So right now I'm a PhD student at the University of New Mexico, but before that I taught rural and suburban kids who enjoyed hands-on learning, and I taught at a school that specialized in career and technical education. And I was hired to teach language arts through these different vocational pathways that the students were interested in, which is why I really wanted a poetry unit that was hands-on. So a few of my students were fans of poetry, and I started looking for a way to make it more hands-on, and while brainstorming I discovered an article about a poetry project conducted by some creative folks in Boston. In the project they selected poems, and a crew of people created stencils of the poems and then applied them to sidewalks using a hydrophobic solution. The result was that when it rained or the sidewalk got wet, the concrete's color darkened in the spaces around the areas protected by the hydrophobic solution. The treated areas remain the lighter color of the dry concrete, like you can see, and the visual effect is that as it rains, letters are revealed on the ground and it appears as if it's raining poetry. So reading the article, I had this eureka moment and I thought, I should totally do this with my students. And so that's what I did. So in the very first iteration of this project, my students constructed their understanding about poetry as they collaborated to write an original poem about whatever they wanted. And then they made a stencil of that poem and then applied it to the sidewalk on our school's campus. So in that iteration, because I let them write about pretty much whatever they wanted for their collaborative poems, the poems took on themes of the students' lives. So they dealt with things like relationships and the challenges of growing up, and then also the sun shining on them and, being at the beach and things like that. In the last iteration of this project, I added a social justice lens and invited an instructional coach to collaborate with me to design a series of workshop-style lessons in which we deliberately scaffolded instruction to co-teach individual Common Core state standards. And so we began with the driving question, how can we use poetry and a super hydrophobic solution to impact a public space with street art featuring a social message? And the instruction was scaffolded to cover a number of language arts standards, in addition to providing students with many opportunities to practice collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and communication. So those 4 C's of 21st century learning. And then I also connected the Common Core to a series of tutorial videos for creating the stencils that can be used with a hydrophobic solution to make this activate on the street when it gets wet. And these resources are all linked below the video. So in the description area right below there, you'll see a link to a PDF for all of the resources for you to use to do the same project. So in keeping with the NCTE's theme this year, that this project lends itself to anti-racist teaching and social justice awareness initiatives. So teachers, I am confident that you can design the content of your poetry unit by yourselves. Like, you do not need my help figuring out how to teach poetry. So I only intend to pass along the resources and ideas related to making it rain poetry. So the specific rain art stuff. And I love this project for a lot of reasons, but specifically I appreciate that it gives students the space to exercise their voices as they collaborate to craft an original poem with a social message as determined by each student group. So they have a lot of freedom and agency to come up with their own message. And it really gives kids a voice and an innovative way to express their views. So to honor and respect the knowledge of my bilingual students, I invited those students to craft their original poems in the language of their choice. So even though it's an English language arts classroom, I did not hold some of my students to to writing their poems in English. So as much as possible, I try to consider my students' cultural backgrounds in the poetry I selected for the instruction and for the assessments. So for example, I incorporated poetry from Guatemala and presented it in both Spanish and English for a summative assessment that allowed students to choose which poems they wanted to analyze from a group of selected poetry. So that's just how I covered it. So here are some of the nuts and bolts about how to make it rain poetry. So to begin with, we hooked the students. We created predetermined groups. Let me back up. So we created the predetermined groups first because we wanted to form these groups so that there were a variety of perspectives and thought styles represented within each group. And then we hooked the students by showing them a short video about street art and another short video about the art form known as rainworks, which is what they were getting ready to do. So making it rain poetry is technically a rainworks type piece of artwork. And then the organizer, like the graphic organizer that I use to help students make their thinking visible, is included on the resource documents that's linked below. And the slideshow that we used with the videos is also there. So everything that we use, you have access to. And so all of these teacher moves that we made in terms of showing them the videos, they were accompanied by prompts and instructions. So for specific details, you can see the original slideshow that we created and the graphic organizer that we used on that resources doc linked below. So after we hooked the students with our introductory activity, the students asked need-to-know questions, which is pretty standard of a project-based learning experience, where they just basically ask the questions that they need to know to be able to complete this project based on the driving question that we presented. So ideally, students will ask a lot of relevant questions, but you can always revisit your need-to-know questions to add more as needed throughout a project like this. So it's actually a good way to sustain the inquiry. And then you can see the few questions that the students asked initially in this iteration of this project on the slideshow. We just typed their need-to-know questions right on there, so you'll be able to see those as well. And you'll see that they didn't ask as many questions as we had hoped. And then that's why we revisit them. So after the need-to-know questions, you're going to get into the day-to-day kind of stuff, the instruction of your poetry unit and teaching them the content elements that you want them to know. So that's going to depend on what you want to cover. You're going to select poetry that's going to introduce your students to the whatever social justice themes that you're interested in and the poetry elements that you're interested in passing along to your students. So I can't really tell you how to do that. That's going to be something that you can figure out on your own, and that's really the fun part of teaching anyway, isn't it? So I have total confidence you'll be able to do that. So teach whatever you want in terms of the poetry. As an option to tie this whole thing into the rain art a little bit more, you could ask your students to include an element or elements from the content that you're teaching into their collaborative poem. You know, like asking them to include a simile or a metaphor or whatever your favorite poetic element is in their poem. I have scaffolded how to create the rain art stuff for you. So at least that part is done. I can do that much for you. You're welcome. Maybe, we'll see, right? So all of the resources that I'm giving you are yours. Please revise them, share them. Don't put them on teachers pay teachers. Like, nobody needs to pay for this stuff. It should be free. This is why I'm giving them away now. So don't go and try to make money off of my work. All right. But please revise it. Make it your own. Do whatever you need to with it to be able to use it. So to begin with the students, after we hooked them and we've taught them some stuff about poetry, I created a standards-based reading assignment as a quick reintroduction to the rain art idea, and then it gives students something relevant and authentic to read to practice these skills and cover the Common Core standards, and that's linked in the resources doc. And then after they read about rain art again, I used some very convenient videos created by this guy named Peregrine Church that walk people through how to create these giant stencils that you will need to basically use to apply the hydrophobic solution onto the ground to create whatever your poem is onto the ground or whatever design you create. and all of those videos are still on YouTube, and the questions I made are related to the Common Core, and they go along with those videos, and they basically walk students through how to create their stencil. And so that's a really useful document, all linked in the resources doc. After the students watched all of those videos, there are 4 videos total, I created a short doc to help students brainstorm and make their thinking visible regarding their plan for creating the group stencil. So instead of just turning students loose and being like, good luck, I created some documents to help guide their thinking throughout the process and make sure that they're kind of on the same page and collaborating. And then after that, I provided steps for them to create a collaborative poem, and then you can use that same 12-step activity. It's all linked in the resources document. And then if you wanted to incorporate some of those elements that you taught in your unit, then this would be the place to ask students to do that. And then after they created their poem, and we had done a gallery walk to make sure that we'd gotten sufficient feedback on our poetry, and we were very confident about these things, we created the stencils, and it was time for the students to put their plan into action. And so they watched, if they needed a refresher, they went back to the videos from Peregrine Church and they watched those again. And they were able to kind of do that on their own, though. But when it comes to the students creating their stencils, there are a lot of things to consider ahead of time. Like, this is a very involved project, and to create stencils, students in my class, we used X-Acto knives, and that's what I would recommend using for anybody, really. X-Acto knives were they were the best thing, because the other option was either scissors, which didn't really cut that well. You were going to try to poke it through a piece of poster board, was tough, and box cutters were bulky, so X-Acto knives kind of were a perfect balance. And to get the ones that I used, I partnered with an art teacher at a school nearby where I was teaching. We didn't have an art program in the school where I was. But the local art teacher was really, really helpful, and I went to him all of the time. And so find your local art teachers, partner with them for this project, use their X-Acto knives. Also, count all of those X-Acto knives to make sure that they all come back, okay, at the end. So if you're going to do this project, you need to make sure that you have permission to use sharp objects with these students. So if that means administrators, parents, everybody involved, get permission to use these sharp objects. And then you have to trust your students not to harm themselves or other people or do anything foolish like carve up the furniture in your classroom, those kinds of things. So you have to really know your students. So it is a big trust kind of project here. And I knew and I loved my students, and we trusted each other, and we had done a lot of teamwork and collaboration and culture building in the classroom before I turned them all loose with X-Acto knives. Okay, so, and there will be resources for that as well. So you also want to think about how you're going to account for these X-Acto knives and supervise the groups. So like maybe you get the group leaders to help you keep track of these X-Acto knives and who's doing what each day. We used a poster board type thickness kind of paper to create our stencils, and I got these poster boards from Advance Auto. So shout out to Advance Auto. I contacted stores in my local area there in Kentucky, and basically what Advance has is they have these advertisements that go on their windows, and they just kind of, they're vinyl and they just cling to the window. Well, when they get these shipped from wherever, they come with these paper backings. And so after they remove the vinyl cling, they're left with this poster board essentially that they just throw away. And so I contacted them and I said, hey guys, whenever you get these new advertisements and you have these huge pieces of like cardboard style type paper or whatever that come off the back of these, can I just come by and pick that up and collect it? And they were like, yeah, you want that stuff? And I was like, yes, I want that. And so over time I was able to collect enough of these things where my students didn't have to pay for any supplies in terms of any poster boards. So find your local places of business that have those big vinyl window advertisements and ask them to get that poster board looking paper that comes off the back of that thing, because they will just give it to you, I'm sure of it. And it's a really easy way to get cheap materials, and they were quality materials. Like there was a glossy side and then a matte side to those, and so you could write in pencil on the matte side and cut right through it, and it worked out really, really well for us, and that's what we used. So that's my advice on that. So again, shout out Advanced Auto. Thank you so much, guys. Cutting boards is another consideration. You're going to have students placing things on tabletops or desks and then using an X-Acto knife to carve into them, so you do not want your furniture being carved up. You can create cardboard cutting boards by layering cardboard and kind of sticking it together somehow, or just putting it down so that way there's an appropriate thickness between the poster board that you're cutting on and the table below. I had custom made cutting boards. I happened to be teaching in a vocational school, and there was a machine tool shop in there, and they had these huge sheets of plastic, and they don't even know where they came from or what they were going to do with them. And so we saw a need and a use for these things, and we turned those sheets of plastic into a bunch of different cutting boards. So I ended up with like a class set of cutting boards. So if you're as fortunate as I was, maybe that'll happen for you. So shout out to Mike Straight for making that happen. Thanks a lot, Mike. And the other consideration for this thing is hot glue guns. So what happens when you make these stencils is you have your poster board, your X-Acto knife, and then when you cut the letters out, inevitably pieces come out. So like if you can imagine an O, right? When you make the O, that middle piece comes out. So when you show the O on the ground, it'll either just be a big circle that won't read necessarily as an O, as it does just as a circle. So to place the middle bit back in, you use these strings and hot glue. And if you watch the videos that Peregrine Church makes, he calls it string theory, which is his fun way to talk about it. But essentially you use hot glue to attach that's called a counter. The piece that comes out of the letter, so the middle of the O that comes out is called a counter. And you put that back in using the strings and hot glue guns. I recommend making stations with your hot glue guns. Get the low temperature hot glue guns. You don't need any really high temperature stuff there. And then maybe designate some team roles ahead of time so that people know who's going to be handling this hot glue gun, that they understand turn it off, turn it back on, that kind of stuff. Unplug it when they're done with it. Don't just leave it laying on a table, those kinds of things. So you have to consider all that. It sounds like a lot, and it sounds like, why would anybody do this thing? It sounds so crazy. It wasn't bad. Like, my students were very mature. I did this with sophomores and with juniors in high school, and they made it work. It was a lot of fun, actually. So just a couple of notes on those resources. Like I mentioned, X-Acto knives, partner with your art teacher. For the string that we use, I found a giant spool of string at like a yard sale somewhere, and it was perfect string. It was lightweight enough where you could break it with your hand, so my students didn't have to use scissors all the time to snap this stuff. And then it was strong enough to hold the hot glue and those counters back in place. So hopefully you can find some string that works that's really cheap. Like I said, I bought a whole huge spool of this stuff for like $1 at a yard sale. To use the hydrophobic spray. If you watch the Rainworks videos that Peregrine Church makes, he uses a product that's more expensive. I used a product called, I can't remember what it's called. It's linked in the resources document. You'll see it. Hydro Express, something like this. It's essentially a car wax product. They're selling it on Amazon, and a little goes a long way. You're not going to be spraying the sidewalk down to drench it. You just put a little bit. You just spray a little bit. And then to hold the posters down so that the wind didn't catch them and then all of the letters laid flat, we use rocks from around the campus. We just had a 5-gallon bucket, and we would place all of these rocks in the bucket, and then if you're lucky, you can find a volunteer to carry the heavy bucket around and place the rocks with you. And then I brought a broom from my house and just swept the area beforehand. And then we had the 5-gallon bucket. It held stones when we when we applied the poem to the ground. And then the next day, to show the students their handiwork, we filled it with water and then brought the 5-gallon bucket back out and dumped it onto the poem, so that way the students could take pictures of it and do all of those things and hang out with their poem and see what it looked like. The other thing I'll say is plan for weather. You want to give the poems about 24 hours kind of to cure on the concrete after you've applied the hydrophobic solution, and so you don't want it to rain on that. So plan for the weather. Obviously you want it to rain shortly after you've applied them though, so again, April being Poetry Month works out really, really well for this kind of project. So I think April, May is the time that I used to do this. So one piece of specific advice that I want to share related to teaching poetry, and I know I said I wasn't going to teach you how to teach poetry, like it's totally not what I want to do, but one thing I did find was helpful when I did this project was we asked students to think of the theme from the poem in terms of hashtags. So we found that it was easier to ask students to assign the poem a hashtag as opposed to saying, what do you think the theme was in this poem? We would say, give this poem a hashtag and then tell us why. What made you give it that hashtag? What was in the poem that made you decide that? And then we found that that was actually a really, really good way to get students to think about themes and then justify their theme with evidence from the text. And so, hashtags. And there are some resources on the resources doc related to that. And so that's why I wanted to bring that up. Some graphic organizers that I created. And then to create a culture for this kind of collaborative project, this kind of collaborative learning, there are some resources on my website, pblplace.com, and they are team and culture building resources that you can use. So, to paraphrase the question posed to us by fellow NCTE member Goldie Muhammad, how could this project help students to learn about themselves or others? Thank you for your time. I appreciate you. Shout out again to NCTE for making an incredible place for educators like us to get together and share ideas. All right, I'm looking forward to hearing feedback from you in the comments. You can email me as well. Thanks. I appreciate you watching. Bye.